Montague, very interesting background, urban planning, environmental science, water law, and then she said, you know what, I want to work for a state agency and get on the ground and solve problems. And so Ada is currently a water planner at the DNRC, served as a head staff member for the Montana Governor's Drought and Water Supply Advisory Committee, and also is the lead water planner for the Clark Fork and Kootenai Basins, where she's tasked with implementing pieces of the state water plan. And Schwend is all things water and has been for a long time, and is really I think probably the most central water on the ground person in the state.
That's a nice way to say it.
Had a long history of working with water issues across Montana. She helped spearhead some of the state's largest water initiatives, things like the State Water Plan, the Big Sky Watershed Corps, which is an amazing program, and has led the National Drought Resiliency Partnership, which is Montana basically a test bed for how do we become resilient to climate change in the future. And so now I'm going to shut up and we'll listen up. Thank you, guys.
Thanks a lot, Wyatt. So I'll take the first half of this topic and then I'll turn it over to Anne. And we understand Rough Cut to be sort of like a, hey, this is something we're thinking about and let's just test it out. And so please feel free to ask questions. This can be very much a back and forth. We put together some slides so that can maybe help direct the conversation, but if you have something you want to visit about that the slides inspire, please feel free. So the title of this talk is Climate Adaptation in the Face of Drought. When you think about this topic, you probably think about some of the changes that we've been seeing here in Montana. Glacier National Park, the glaciers have been receding. That's brought some headlines on climate change and climate effects happening locally. We've definitely seen some changes in the snowpack, at least in the last couple of years, with early runoff periods that wiped out our water reserves for the summer and left us pretty high and dry by August. We've also seen increased river temperatures that have led to some pretty dramatic consequences. In part, the Yellowstone fish kill that occurred last summer was related to low flows and high temperatures that allowed the proliferative kidney disease to thrive in whitefish. And then we've seen our neighbors in California struggle with a pretty severe drought for the last 4 or 5 years. They're finally coming out of it now, which is good news. But they're starting to see some of the flip side of drought, where a lot of water depletion has also left them very vulnerable to the effects of flooding. So all that has added up to Montana taking a closer look at climate adaptation in the face of drought. Now, when you think about climate adaptation in the face of drought, you probably think about, well, what crops are people planting? How are people managing their water resources? What kind of land use planning regulations do we need? So I put these slides up here to be like, yeah, I get that, and I know that that's part of the picture, but when I think about it, I have to think about an entire state, and I have to think about all the different agencies and nonprofits and commercial efforts that are out there that are impacted by drought and have their own various definitions of drought. So how does one bring all that together and come up with an adaptation strategy that would work at a statewide level and is also not impinging upon A, the water rights at the local level, as well as B, the democratic interest that we all have in having some self-direction. So right now, or let's just take a little look at how drought planning has occurred in Montana. And this is not to diss Montana or anything, but a lot of states, a lot of people have struggled with drought because it's this slow onset thing. You get concerned, there's panic, then it rains, and everyone's like, okay, well, we're fine. Like today, it's snowing. Why are we talking about drought? That kind of thing. So it's comically referred to as the hydrologic cycle. It has had an impact on our drought planning here in Montana. The first time it was sort of taken up was in the 1930s when we had the Dust Bowl, and this led to the state implementing some techniques that helped people make better decisions about how to manage their farmland. And that actually made the drought in the 1950s less severe. So it was a positive effect after going through some efforts at the state level to try to control factors related to drought. In the 1980s, we again were faced with some pretty dry conditions, and they decided at the legislature to create the Governor's Drought and Water Supply Advisory Committee. which is what I staffed, as Wyatt pointed out. That then, in the 1990s, they said you guys should probably create a drought plan. So that's now also in our statutes. The drought plan that we operate under currently is from 1995. In the 2000s, they talked about updating it, and then again, this cycle kind of happened, and it just was never a huge priority for the state. And we may fall back into that cycle, but hopefully not. Hopefully we can continue to build on the momentum from the concern that's been raised in the last few years. On the other hand, I hope we don't face drought, right? So currently, some of the drivers in this discussion are the Montana State Water Plan, which was completed in 2015, and they identified one of the major priorities is planning for and building more resilience in the face of drought. We also have a very diverse state with east and west of the Continental Divide, as well as an enormous amount of dryland farming. And then we also have some very mountainous terrain where we have tourism economy, as well as irrigated agriculture that relies on those snowpacks. And then the nature of drought is just important to just touch on. It's, as I said, very slow moving. It's hard to pinpoint. It's hard to define. You know, is it a hydrologic drought? Is it a meteorologic drought? Is it a socioeconomic drought? There's a lot of different ways that one can experience dry conditions. And, you know, ultimately, are you going to measure that based on your bottom line as a business, or based on the health of your fishery, if you're a fisheries biologist, or on the health of your crops, if you're an agriculturalist? So the current Montana Drought Response Plan, it sets up a couple of different interesting ideas. The duties of the Drought Advisory Committee are delineated. There's different agencies that sit on that committee, FWP, Department of Commerce, DEQ, DNRC, the Governor's Office, and they all have an opportunity to assess conditions and make that information available to the public. And they can also set two different levels of drought severity. There's a drought alert, and then there's severe drought. The way that the plan was written is that local advisory committees would form around the state, and that they would then carry out the efforts that were outlined in the plan at each of those different levels of drought. These local drought advisory committees never really happened, and that might have been part of this hydrologic cycle, right? It just never really became a huge priority. Unfortunately, there have been, in the wake of that, some questions that got left unanswered. And so we saw some places developing their own drought response plans, like on the Blackfoot, a nonprofit Watershed Group came together, and they, as a group of stakeholders, decided, okay, we're gonna have a drought response plan. When certain water levels are hit at our stream gauges, we are going to go into a shared sacrifice mode. And that has had, you know, pros and cons in and of itself. On the Big Hole, there was a similar effort, and I'll let Ann talk to that because she's way more knowledgeable about it. But in any case, so some things happened in the state just sort of based on organic grassroots efforts, but it wasn't coming from this plan so much. The Drought Advisory Committee has been meeting religiously, and they've created a map that's available that dates back from 2003 that tells you where things were dry. So that's one product that you can thank this plan for creating, essentially. But it was dated from 1995, and so with all these other factors of watching California go through its process and glaciers receding, et cetera, a lot of states, actually, not just Montana, are picking up their dusty old drought management plans, including Oregon and Washington, and Idaho, and thinking a little bit more about, okay, well, what do we need to do to make this actually function on the ground? Like, what can we do to offset the impacts of drought, and even maybe prevent them from happening, like build that resilience into our system? So how do we do that? Like, how do we actually adapt to changes in our hydrology, in our water supply, that accounts for all people, all concerns, that is democratic, that is equal, and isn't an affront to the prior appropriation doctrine? So the main thing that we've identified is that we really need to have not just an emergency response approach, but we need to have long-term mitigation strategies. So our modus operandi as Montanans is, what can we do all the time to be thinking about building up our soil moisture, thinking about municipal water supplies. What are the sources of water supply for your town? Do you know? Is that something that your town has thought about? Has there ever been a time when your town has been short of getting the water it needs to just deal with basic processing? These are questions that we just don't know the answers to yet in Montana, but we're starting to build that conversation and that base of knowledge. We want to make sure that this plan is driven by local communities, that the state isn't coming in and telling people what to do, but that the state is looked at as a resource for facilitation, for collaboration, for providing some kind of framework, and hopefully some financial resources if we can, as well as informational resources as well. So we're in the process of developing those, and I'll let Ann tackle this again in a moment, but one of the resources that she was able to get for the Upper Missouri Headwaters is a grant from the Bureau of Reclamation. They have this Water Smart program, and part of that deals with drought resilience. And so she was successful in getting one of those grants and is now helping communities take advantage of that financial assistance. And then a big part is improving collaboration, making sure that all these agencies who sit on the Drought Advisory Committee know what each other does in the face of water short conditions. That then translates to their county counterparts. So the FWP fisheries biologists know about the Department of Emergency Services DDS coordinators, who both work together at the county level, and that they're in touch with the county commissioners. And that all of those communication pieces are happening at an appropriate time, like when things get drier, ideally before then. So how do we take these broad concepts of locally driven drought management and having the state kind of build the framework for that? It's not as direct as this beautiful picture of a long straight road, unfortunately. It's pretty complicated. I mean, we have in Montana, oh gosh, is it 56 counties? So there's 56 counties. They have their own political lines. There's a whole structure that is associated with those political lines. Not just with the county commissioners, but also with the interrelationships inside the county, like, for example, the city of Bozeman versus Gallatin County. And then you have all the different state-based resources that occur at the county level, like DEQ, water sanitarians. We also have tribal nations within our state. We have, I believe it's 7 recognized and 1 not federally recognized tribe, and the Little Shell. But so these are like different countries within the state of Montana that have their own sovereignty. They have their own political realities and strategies and functionings. So taking that into account, and like, how do these two entities, the state government and tribal governments, interrelate and interact? There's watershed groups. So, okay, again, and I'm not sure how many in number.
About 63.
About 63 watershed groups. And you can see these lines are very different than the ones that delineated the counties. Watershed groups have formed in all the places that have color on this map. So there's quite a number of them, and they're stakeholder driven. People have a lot of commitment to their watershed groups, and they see a lot of benefit coming from them. So that is a very important piece to our work and understanding of drought management. We also have conservation districts. Again, the lines are different, and they also have a structure. They have statutory regulation. They have a whole section of law within our Montana Code Annotated that they adhere to and can operate under. They have their own political clout. They have their own realities when it comes to watershed management. We also have our extension agents. They're going to be focused on their own set of priorities and their geographic boundaries. We also have our DDS coordinators. Again, a whole nother slew of priorities, modes of operation, and all these things have to be built into our mode of operation at the state DNRC office. So Ann, myself, and 2 other water planners are tasked with implementing the state water plan, which divides up the state into these 4 watershed basins. The basin I work in is the Clark Fork and Kootenai. Ann is in the Upper Missouri. Michael Downey is in the Lower Missouri, and Sarah Malloy is in the Yellowstone. So we each have that kind of perspective on the landscape. Montana is a little paranoid about the government coming in and taking what's theirs, right? So how do we go forward? How do we start this conversation? How do we build trust? How do we think about climate adaptation in the face of drought. So there's certain drivers, and this is a network governance theory that some folks, Emerson and Nabachi, have demonstrated in this nice little graphic. Basically, a process gets started when you have some kind of driver. In this case, we have several, but they're related to drought, so we'll just call it drought. That sets in motion different types of dynamics, conversations, funding structures, policy decisions, and all those things have their own group dynamics. And understanding how to harness those so that everything is functioning like a well-tuned clock, and we come out the other end with some kind of action and outcome that then feeds the entire system and addresses our driver, is a very complicated process. And that's where planners come in. We're able to manage networks. That's what we do. And the idea of climate adaptation in the face of drought really for us starts with adaptive management of these networks. Figuring out who are the organizations that need to be included in this conversation. What kinds of connections do they already have between each other that we need to appreciate and not A, step on anyone's toes, or B, not leave someone out who needs to be part of that. And that would lead us to subgroups. So what lower level or less major players are also intertwined in this conversation, in this discussion, in this group dynamic that we need to be taking into account. And then how often do we need to interact with each of these different levels of the landscape that we're working in? So for example, at the state drought management plan update process that we've started, we have a working group, and we've identified a slew of about 15 different people who represent the 8 different types of water users that we came up with. And they meet with me once a month for a teleconference. I don't want to waste their time. They have busy lives. They're all volunteering to give me insight from their various perspectives. But that monthly check-in allows them to feel like, okay, we know what the state's doing. We can tell our constituents. We can give feedback. There's a process in place where we can do that. So far, that seems to be working pretty well. If something was to come up, like some aspect was especially controversial, we may have to increase that frequency. Some places, some aspects you might have to interact with more, some less, and you just kind of have to figure that out. And then through that effort, you typically identify additional ties between different aspects of what you're working on. So if you're doing, say, a drought vulnerability assessment, you're working with perhaps an engineering firm that's helping you do the actual work of assessing conditions, but you're also thinking about, well, who are our major water right holders in this basin? And what does that mean for the downstream hydropower company? Or how does that impact how we're going to manage our high elevation reservoirs, for example? Or do we need to install more of those? Or do we need to be thinking about wetland mitigation or floodplain management decision making? And that then brings us back to kind of who we are talking to in all those different geographic landscapes I was showing you pictures of previously. So in order to make sure that we're talking to people in the right way, we need a slew of different communication skills. And we need to be able to provide those information pieces in a way that different types of people can consume. We have to talk the right language to the right people. If we come to you and start talking too much about process or touchy-feely, like political science maybe, or something like that. As scientists, I am assuming you guys are mostly scientists, maybe I'm incorrect, but that might be like really not interesting enough. So hopefully this talk is getting at that technical piece that you feel like, okay, this gives me a nugget that I need so I can go back to my work and I can apply this. On the other hand, we have a lot of people we talk to who are like, dude, I do not need any more science. Like, I just need you to tell me if it's dry out there or not, and if I should plant, a more drought-tolerant crop. So figuring out how to deliver that information and coming up with a variety of ways to provide that is in and of itself a form of adapting. And so we are constantly reevaluating, okay, we did that brochure, that seemed to work, okay, let's try this Survey Monkey, and maybe we should do a newsletter through, what's the program? Animal, yeah. How did that work? And the nice thing with MailChimp is it gives you metrics, so you can kind of see, oh, these people click these links, and that's working over there. And anyways, this is kind of public outreach process, but it's also making sure you get the right information in front of the right people at the right time. Okay, so then that brings us to what we're trying to do, which is co-manage resources, which is a new era, right? Like, this is not something you're used to hearing from the government. But we've learned from history that really, especially when it comes to water resources, especially in a water tight basin or state, especially one that is dictated by the maxims of the prior appropriation doctrine, we cannot live in a directive manner on this topic. So how do we connect the state efforts into local efforts that actually bear some fruit? And this is where I'd like to turn it over to Anne, who's going to take us into the world that she lives in a little more.
Do you want to pause for a moment? Were there any questions
sure,
for Anna before we jump into sort of, this is going to be more of a local, this is going to be a case scenario about what we're doing in Montana, thinking about adaptation. Any questions? Anybody? Okay, so thinking about these ideas and planners, we have had an opportunity that came to us a couple of years ago called the National Drought Resilience Partnership. I like to say it sort of landed on us, where we were chosen, maybe. But basically, this came out of, it was an initiative that started out of the White House Climate Action Plan. President Obama put this in place in 2014. And he said, what we want to do is showcase how we can take all these federal agencies and these partners and deliver resources to basically get that on the ground and try to develop resilience at the community level, or climate adaptation strategies, or what can we be doing in terms of thinking about mitigating for climate change. Where we are with the National Drought Resilience Partnership, or with being able to say this at the national level now, I don't know that we really have that happening at the Washington level, but it was a really good idea. And at a Western Governors Association meeting, our governor, Steve Bullock, got together with Sean McGrath, who was then the administrator for Region 8 of EPA, who had been working on drought for a long time. And because there was an announcement about a collaborative project or a cooperative agreement we were doing with the Bureau of Reclamation, it was a basin study that we're doing in the entire upper Missouri Basin. So here to the headwaters, and then all the way to Fort Peck. That was announced. Governor Bullock and Sean McGrath looked at each other and said, because they were looking as part of this climate action plan, they were looking for a place where they could do a demonstration project and say, what is this really going to look like on the ground, and how are we going to put this in place? So they decided to select the upper Missouri, and then it came to me because I'm the planner in the upper Missouri, and we were focusing primarily on this area, on the upper Missouri Basin. And I said, wow, that's a great opportunity. So do we have some money, or what kinds of resources are we getting for that? And they said, oh no, there really aren't any resources. We're just gonna all get together, and this is gonna be a proof of concept. So I said, that's a great idea. So do you guys think we could reduce the size of the area of the basin that we're working on just a little bit and see if we can make this work? The other thing it was predicated on was Big Sky Watershed Corps members, as Wyatt mentioned, which are AmeriCorps members, college graduates that we place in watersheds in Montana, and they do community service for a year, and they're really talented and amazing. And my director, John Tubbs, said, we want to link AmeriCorps members in with this drought resilience planning project. So I said, okay, we have some members already housed with watershed groups and conservation districts in the upper Missouri. Let's focus on this area. We have very functional watershed groups that are there, and people are really engaged. Besides that, it's the headwaters to the Missouri, which is sort of important as a continent, and thinking about water management and what we're doing. And if we could do a proof of concept in the upper Missouri, in an area that's pretty traditionally rural agriculture and a lot of recreation, as you know. So we honed it down and decided to do it here. If you look at the upper Missouri, it has 8 Huck 8 watersheds. For purposes of our planning, we decided to break up the Gallatin with the upper and the lower, because as we know, Big Sky is very different than the lower Gallatin and Bozeman in the Amsterdam area in terms of water management and planning. So the idea, as the federal government came to us and said, okay, let's get going on this, and we at the state said, all right, that sounds like a good idea. How do we want to do this? We said that it was really important that the state of Montana be the lead, and that we set this and we say this has to happen from the ground up. We feel very strongly that we don't want the federal government to come in and tell these communities what they need to do or how they need to do that. So as Ada is referring to, it's like, how do we bring this information in, and how do we help these communities or lead this effort? Because we think for long-term sustainability, having the communities engaged is really going to be key. So we set 3 project goals. Basically, in my mind, leveraging and delivering these resources at different levels, engaging the communities, and then ultimately, how will that lead to implementing projects? And that's where we get to really the actions on the ground. Oh, it doesn't have my nice, it came in at different levels, sorry, so now you guys have to look at a busy slide. But thinking about leveraging those resources, so we have the National Drought Resilience Partnership, which is being led by CEQ out of the White House, and they're saying this is what you guys ought to do, but we don't really know what that is. And then the federal agencies all saying, wow, that's really a great idea, how can we help? And then the state agencies, and as I said, it's sort of about how do we bring these, if we think about a watershed level, or if we think about leveraging this, how do we bring these resources in terms of data and partnerships and tools and funding? And I'm looking at the university people and thinking you guys are really an important part of this as well. How do we pull all of that together, sort of mix it up here in the middle with other partners, the universities and other statewide organizations and nonprofits and nationals? How do we pull all of that together, kind of mix it all up, and then divide it across a large landscape, or sort of deliver that information across a large landscape, particularly through local drought coordinators, so that they're getting everything they need, and then basically creating this iterative cycle about how that's going back. It's been a pretty interesting project. As I said, we started out and there wasn't really very much funding, and it was pretty challenging, and I'm fairly scrappy, and so I'm writing a lot of grants and trying to figure out ways that we can do this. And working with these different watershed groups or conservation districts, tons and tons of partners have come to the table. To date, at this point, in 2 years into the project, we've managed to leverage $3.4 million into the Upper Missouri Basin, both in planning and capacity and projects that are on the ground and through these partnerships. And then, as Ada mentioned, lately we have these local drought contingency planning dollars. So not a whole lot of money, but if you think about these local groups, these communities, they don't have any money to begin with. Most of them are nonprofits and they're singing for their supper. And so I have, each of them are getting like $20,000 to lead the process in their community. And the Greater Gallatin Watershed Council and Brad Bauer and Madison are here, going to be helping here in the Lower Gallatin, which is very cool. So the idea was, and this was an aha moment for me when we started doing this Drought Resilience Partnership, we hadn't really developed a model for how do we do drought planning at the local basis. We're calling it drought planning, but it's really about how are we doing water management planning? What does that really look like? And Ada and I were having this conversation on the way over. People often think planning isn't really that important, but here in the Upper Missouri Basin, we are closed to any new surface water right appropriations, right? You can't get a new water right. We're not making any more water. And if you have to if you're going to do a development, or if you need large amounts of water, larger than your domestic wells, your 35 gallon a minute, you have to purchase a water right from someone else, or you have to mitigate, and you have to prove that if you do a groundwater development, that's not going to have an impact on anyone else or surface flows. So in theory, we talk about drought and not having enough water, but we're really running up against some issues about not having enough water as we are now, to meet all of the needs that we have. If we want to talk about resilient communities and adaptation strategies, we need to be thinking about both sides of the equation and helping these communities understand that they need to plan for not having enough water, and where do they need to be creating strategies about how to do that best. So we worked with the National Drought Mitigation Center and NOAA and the National Integrated Drought Information System, Bureau of Reclamation, and lots of these partners, and said, we developed this community resilient, developing resilient communities course. And it's basically just a process, and I'm not going to go through all the details of it, but it's a process to help these local drought coordinators within their communities lead the rest of their stakeholders, their water users, through this process. And the idea behind that is to get the communities to understand how complicated water management is, because between the hydrology and the administration and water rights and all those factors in play and growing demand, and now you add climate change on top of that, you really have to you've got to think about all the pieces and parts. So how do you bring that information together, and how do you get the stakeholders, that variety of stakeholders, whether they're ag producers or they're county commissioners or they're your conservation district or there's somebody who's just moved here from out of state, to understand the challenge that you have or that they have as a community for leading that. So getting through some of those pieces of that and then talking about where are they most vulnerable. Autumn mentioned it as well. If you think about here in Bozeman, you guys, the city of Bozeman, you have done an integrated water resource management plan, which is leading the way across the state. No other municipalities have even thought about doing that, and that's huge. And you have already projected current growth rates, 2050, you don't have enough water to meet your supplies, right? So it's time to be thinking, so you can think about the municipality. What if you think about the bigger watershed? When and where is your water coming from? Where is it going? And how can you where are you most vulnerable? Where as a watershed community are you most vulnerable? And where are you going to have your greatest impacts? And thinking about that. And then how do you develop either a response plan, like, oh boy, we're really in trouble now. For example, the city of West Yellowstone, their municipal water supply, they have a spring that they have relied on since they have been an incorporated community. And last year, on June 20th, they were exceeding, their water that they were diverting and delivering was exceeding the production of the spring, because the spring is now producing half of what it has historically. It's like, that might be a little bit of a problem for them. They need to have an immediate plan. They need to have a response plan, like, oh, okay, we got to shut this down. This is what we're going to do. But most importantly, and this is where we are with the adaptation, are our mitigation strategies. What are the things that you can be doing when you were not? Here's our response plan. That's the jump on it, right? Let's get going. We're in crisis mode. We have to have response action. We need to know who to call. We need to figure out where our backup water is. Tell everyone to fill their bathtubs, whatever that's going to take. Or if you have triggers, if you have stream flow, if you are one of the few communities that has developed that for your river system, what kinds of places, where can you see those shared shortages, or where can you get some of your irrigators or diverters or municipalities to think about the water differently. The long term, the adaptation strategy, I call this my pasta salad, because I love inviting way more people than I could really feed, right? So not knowing how many are going to be there, not knowing exactly what you're going to need, having something that has some flexibility, that we can say, okay, these are the kinds of plans or actions that we can be taking that are hopefully going to mitigate climate change or a changing water scenario. I actually want to get to this specifically. Thinking about drought resilience and adaptation, we've been talking a lot about drought, but I do want to say that it's a lot about our water supply. As a water planner, we have two sides of this equation, right? We have our supply and we have our demand. We know that we are not getting any more supply. There's a pretty finite amount that's coming. What's changing is when and where we get that supply. With our snowpack, our runoff coming out generally 2 weeks earlier now, how do we think about the systems that we have always used and relied upon? What's happening with this supply, and then what's happening with demand? Generally our demand is increasing, it's not decreasing. So if we're trying to balance water for the future and for all of us to have enough within our budget, what are the kinds of things, how do we approach either side of this? And I like to think about many of the discussions that we're having, and these are really our mitigation strategies or our adaptation strategies, is thinking about our supply. How can we capture more of that water higher in the elevations during the season? If you think about your water supply, even like a bank account, when the snowpack's coming off, if it's in the rivers and we don't put it out on that landscape and saturate that sponge or sort of slow it down a little bit, it's down the river and it's gone. And it's out of your watershed or it's out of your community before you can really use it. we want to have water in our streams, but we also have a lot of needs that we need to meet. So if we think about saturating that sponge, particularly high elevations where we have cooler temperatures, where we have natural conditions, where you can be using things like wetlands and beavers and natural storage, about maintaining that water high in the elevations. One of the pieces that's been coming up lately that I'm seeing a lot of is thinking about managing our forests for water yield rather than just for timber. We always hear Forest Service people talking about the value of the board feet and the timber that are occurring there. And I would throw it out there that I think probably the most valuable resource we may have in our forested landscapes is water. And not just managing for the yield, but thinking about the quality of that water and the timing of when that water is coming off of your forested landscapes and how are we hanging on to that. And Catherine, thinking about our rangelands and soil health is huge. If we can improve soil health across our rangelands and our croplands, we're saturating that sponge, right? We're all going to be, I mean, those are some good ideas. So these are, and floodplain management, certainly. If you are creating floodplains that are resilient, that are connected, that have big flood storage areas, you're also attenuating for floods. You're meeting both sides of that spectrum, thinking about an adaptation strategy. Thinking about places where we can be doing land use planning to allow flooding to occur, or encouraging people to do that. And if we think about the demand side strategies, it's certainly conservation comes up, increasing awareness and understanding, thinking about conveyance and delivery in our irrigation systems, and it's not always as simple as converting from flood irrigation to pivot irrigation, because what we're looking at is consumption, not just diversion. So thinking, strategizing about where is flood irrigation maybe a good thing in our floodplain areas or fairly close to those streams so that we're getting some of that late season return flow and recharge, and pivots being maybe in a different location or thinking about how you're using those pivots and that water consumptively. Community-wide conservation, drought planning, which is basically tying back into increasing the public awareness and understanding, and then voluntary agreements where if you have a response plan in place and everybody has agreed on certain triggers or flows or indicators, what does that look like? And then how do they, this is Mike Roberts, a photo of Mike Roberts. How many of you are familiar with the project in the Big Hole and the candidate conservation with assurances, agreements with assurances? A few people. So in the Big Hole, just as a quick example, that's an area where, particularly in the upper Big Hole, the fluvial grayling were going to be a threatened species, threatened and endangered species. And they worked really hard. We have a team of people, our hydrologists and fisheries biologists, who have worked with the individual landowners to basically get them signed on to these agreements that say they will do whole water management plans for their ranches. And so if and when the Arctic grayling were ever going to be listed, they would sort of be exempt from any of the issues that may arise from that. And it has been a great example of a community coming together and all the people that are there sort of signing on and understanding the value of sharing the water and understanding the triggers and putting water back in the stream when they need it. You know, these are sort of key elements about our planning and the efforts that we have. As Ada has said, engaging our community leaders, recruiting partners, increasing the awareness, coordinating our resources. That's where I see, you know, academics and the university coming in, thinking about how you guys, and why you started this conversation was saying, you tend to do your work here. We tend to be from the government, and of course we always say we're from the government, we're here to help, but to me, we're dot connectors. We are trying to be the people that are saying, how can we learn from you guys and hear about the research that you're doing and help deliver that information or help connect the people that are on the ground that have that local knowledge and that understanding of their communities and their ecosystems. How can we get them, how can we get the information to them? And vice versa, how can we learn from when you deliver that information, how does that come back up? And how does that inform additional research that you guys are doing? And how do we think about that in a full loop instead of being in our own silos and saying, we're doing research, we're trying to do planning, the people on the ground are just trying to grow crops, so they're just trying to live in their communities. Think about that in a little bit more of a collaborative spirit. And that would be it. So I don't know if we really answered your questions about the climate adaptation, but I hope that you have a better understanding. You know, we're trying to lay the groundwork and make these connections so that we can, and build that trust in those relationships so that we can really help local communities figure out how to do this themselves. I think that's probably the key takeaway.
Any questions?
You guys warm enough in here? A little climate change? Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you touched on the fact that we need more of a circular information flow, but I don't have the sense that there's really a plan for how you might implement the idea of informing our research questions. So that's a side that it's not clear to me. I mean, there's lots of back and forth with the communities, et cetera, but we, as perhaps another kind of community, I don't think we're getting a sense that we're getting that flow. Maybe others are, but I don't.
Well, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, I think that there is this disconnect. So if we go back to that sort of watershed approach, how can we deliver how can we help connect you with maybe anyone else who's doing a similar kind of project? And I'm experiencing that in the Upper Missouri a lot. I hear conversations all the time about different research that's going on, and it's beginning to make my head swim. The number of people that are doing work, and it's great work, but it's like, oh, you should be paying attention. Like, you guys need to team up and figure out what's going on here. So there's the connecting some of the research, whether that's applied on the ground or it's laboratory research. It's connecting that, and then it's connecting with other agencies that maybe have resources. Getting that down on the ground, that's a tough piece. And I think as we are starting these community drought planning efforts, as they start to go through their vulnerability assessments, and I think that there's going to be a hunger for more knowledge. And I'm hoping that what will happen organically is that these groups are asking the questions themselves, and then we're prepared to say, boy, you really ought to, we've got some folks at MSU who are really working on this, or we've got somebody at the Institute on Ecosystems or the Water Center, or with EPA, or with, somehow, and so it's just trying to make those connections or kind of weave that cloth together so that it makes some sense.
Yeah, and I mean, our emails are there. Wyatt, you know how to get a hold of him perhaps. So that's a start. I mean, U of M had recently got some money to do a study on how to make information on monitoring conditions more useful to producers. And so they contacted us to get the names of producers so they could form some, what do they call it, outreach groups or target groups that are going to, focus groups, thank you, that are going to sit down and discuss with them, like, okay, this is how I consume information. I want to use my phone. I want to know these 3 different types of data points, and I need it in a format that is much faster or, whatever.
Or slower.
Or slower, like more iterative or not, or whatever. So
Right.
Those kinds of things are starting to happen. So that might give you an example. And that professor got linked to us through our connections with the climate office.
Right.
So.
Yeah.
Curious about the extent to which your efforts distinguish hydrologic drought, which is typically defined as discrete in time and space, versus long-term monotonic changes in background aridity from increasing temperatures, which is sort of a trickier wicket because it's not necessarily directly addressed by the distribution of surface water resources or soil water, for that matter.
In a
So-
spatial or temporal.
I interact with the U.S. Drought Monitor on a weekly basis, and they are discussing that issue at the national level. So I don't know if we have a really good answer for you right now, but I do know that, like, for example, if you look at the city of Bozeman's drought management plan that they just adopted, they looked at historic drought. I know Greg Peterson's work through USGS. Yeah, he's looking at dendrochronology and trying to figure out, okay, long term, what have we seen in terms of cycles? How long did they last? When did we start to see we're coming out of it? And using that as a way to measure, the long-term effects of aridity and how we survive through those time periods. Does that get at what you're asking?
I guess I would say, and I tend to be a little bit more on the process, I'm the big picture person saying, whether you call it tomato or tomato, it's drought. We really basically particularly in the upper Missouri Basin, because of the administrative closures, we're in drought. Whether you want to define it as a hydrologic or an economic or an administrative drought, we don't have enough water right now. We need to be thinking that way. We need to be planning for the fact that we don't have enough water at this point in time.
You touched on the topic of people people having different understandings of the word efficiency. And to me, that's maybe one of the most dangerous topics and places where we have a huge opportunity to slow down anti-progress right now with leaky irrigation infrastructure and things like that, where we're getting storage and there's
Inadvertent
storage and projects are going on the ground all the time that are counteracting that. What fraction of the people that you talk to do you think get the difference between efficiency, meaning loss to evapotranspiration, versus loss that goes back into the system?
So I'll give you the hopeful answer because it's improving all the time. I think when I started this job 8 years ago, I was surprised at how much people, we had this belief that by always going to, when we talk about irrigation efficiency, they would talk about going to a center pivot, that was irrigation efficiency, and I wouldn't disagree, it is irrigation efficiency, but it does not equate to a reduction in water that's consumed. It's irrigation efficiency, like labor efficiency and getting the water out on the ground and being very precise, but it is not necessarily, and you divert less water often from your source when you're delivering it to that.
But you use
So
more.
the idea is maybe even to not use the term efficiency, but talk about water consumption, because your evapotranspiration or how much water is lost to the system. And trying to get people to understand that there is great benefit in wetting that sponge and sort of thinking that the inefficiencies or the accidental recharge of our shallow surface water is really fairly important for our management, particularly higher elevations, particularly in your headwaters, or here even in Bozeman and your floodplains, and thinking about that. So people are getting better about it, but they still have that tendency to talk about efficiency and think that means conservation, and they're not the same.
I guess just really quickly, related to that, perhaps one of the most useful audiences to educate on that topic are the people making decisions about those projects going on the ground, like the technical service providers with state and federal agencies. Are there efforts afoot for that type of work?
There are. I mean, we're trying to do that, but you have to walk the line very carefully. I mean, it's because it isn't every situation, and it's soil dependent, and it's the your diversion dependent and how far you're going. I mean, there are all kinds of pieces and parameters. There's not just a single answer to say this is the difference between flood or pivot irrigation. It's important, but you're right. Trying to get some of the technical service providers to understand that a little bit better, and the producers to understand, and that there's value. Or even oftentimes we hear, like the fishing industry will have a tendency to badmouth irrigators and say they're taking all the water, they're terrible, we don't want to see any more flood irrigation, that isn't really a good idea. But we can show, and I'll use the example in the Ruby since that's where I was working, that because of all the flood irrigation, we had surface water flows at the mouth of the Ruby in September that we couldn't account for coming in from the tributaries or being released from the dam. It was all short-term return flow because of the flood irrigation. So I could say to the fishermen, hey, actually, these are like beavers out on the landscape, and when we have high spring flows, they're getting that water out there through all these laterals, and they're wetting this area down so that it stays green through the summer, and that we see flows in September. That isn't always exactly the case, though, but it can be site specific.
So going on from that theme, in the states that have had some serious problems with drought, they've done some pretty dramatic engineering efforts to manage recharging, but not counting on just natural processes. Is that a direction that part of Montana's plan if we get into a more severe drought situation?
I would hope so. I mean, I think we're trying to think about it holistically. And so maybe there are places where, you know, that infrastructure improvements are good in your conveyance, but, and trying to be prepared for drought, but it's time for us all to sort of tighten our belts and be thinking, and whether it's climate driven or not, I mean, the state is, we're looking at that. I mean, I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Well, I think
I'm just
the
thinking,
last two comments are highly informative to the process that
Yeah.
I'm engaged in. So both working with the on-the-ground tech people who are implementing sprinkler systems, as well as looking at what other states have done who have been really severely taxed by drought and the way that they've addressed their irrigation infrastructure. Those are mentally noted for me. So I'll make sure that as we move through our update process, those are accounted for. I don't know how exactly it will look coming out the other end. I don't know if our plan's gonna say, we need to have this infrastructure put in this location. I doubt it, but we could maybe say, this needs further exploration, or we need a policy on this.
Yeah.
So if you had information for me, I would really appreciate that.
Oh, not any expert information, just.
But well,
Just to
it's
say,
a
the idea
great
that,
suggestion.
you know, you can create infiltration basins that are specifically for infiltration and have absolutely nothing to do with irrigation.
Yeah.
It's like
Right.
full-on engineering solution to the problem. It's like, we need to get water in storage one way or another.
Right, but the challenge like we have in the upper Missouri is that we don't have the water rights to do that.
Right.
Right, so there are no water rights available to be able to do that. In Idaho on the Snake River Plain, they are using infiltration galleries and really specifically targeting areas where they are doing that. And they're having some success with that, but fortunately here in Montana, we manage water conjunctively. So we don't think of our surface water and our groundwater as separate resources. We have identified that they are connected. And that's huge. You know, I mean, you may not think that that's that important, but California is a great example of where they were not paying attention and they were mining their groundwater. And so it exacerbated their drought. We're in really pretty good shape because we're still a little bit ahead of it and we have some great opportunities if we're creative and we think about different strategies. And that there isn't a single panacea, there's not one thing that we can do that's going to make us more resilient. It's gonna be, instead of death by 1,000 cuts, it's gonna be success through 1,000 small projects and thinking more creatively.
And if you guys have ideas, please do write our contact information down, and please feel free to send an email if you think of a project or an idea that you'd like the state to flesh out a bit more. Yeah, we're at your disposal.
Wyatt.
So as part of the Upper Missouri Partnership, you guys are linking with modelers to ask, so basically take climate flow models and link them to management models.
Yes.
And I think that's really interesting and really powerful, and looking at scenarios for water use in the future. I think in terms of involving the university folks, that's the perfect kind of, the time is now to say, you know, here's what start interacting with those modelers,
Right.
and then designing statewide experiments, basically where we can. So that under these scenarios, this is what, if this group did this and this group did this is what we predict based
Right.
on. I think you can get a lot of people in the universities really excited about working on those things. I wonder, is that part of it?
Understanding that. Yeah, I think it is. And I think, you know, so right now what you're talking about is this modeling effort that we're doing as part of the basin study with Bureau of Reclamation, and then some other modeling efforts from USGS and other folks that are coming together and saying, let's work on this together. So the next phase, Bureau of Reclamation is just finishing their impact assessment phase. The next phase is going to be selecting some scenarios, working with these groups. What I'm hearing right now is that they haven't tried the model yet, and so as soon as we try the model, I think it's going to be at a pretty high, low resolution, high resolution. And so I think we have to try it, as you do with any model, and see how well that's going to work, and whether that's answering the questions. So I think there are going to be a lot of opportunities for iteration on that, and thinking, how do we, you know, if we've started here, how can we then refine that? We're also doing quite a bit with remote sensing, and looking at natural storage and how, if we can begin to quantify those effects, if we've targeted some areas, are there ways that we can quantify how much water we're really able to store in these wetlands or these high elevation systems?
And I am interested in maybe taking on an intern or two. I can work with professors here to explore that. I'm going to figure out what it takes to do that from the DNRC's perspective. Issues that I'd like to look at are defining drought for the state, and I have kind of a collaborative team that started working on this question already. I can get into it more another time. I'm also interested in just trying to find out what each agency already does, just kind of cataloging that and trying to evaluate, what are beneficial, what are not so beneficial efforts or something like that.
So I,
One more.
I was gonna say, I'd throw it out there and say, do you guys have ideas about ways that we could improve the communication? I hope that even just us being here today helps. Think about what kinds of things can we help you do, or how can we help you with your research or making those connections? I'd love to hear that, if you have any ideas. That's a good way to stifle it.
I think maybe one last quick question, unless someone wants to respond to that, and then we should call it.
I would say I think this would be a good start, because I think there should be a gap that should be filled between the researcher community and then governmental or other entities. So I would say this can be a routine thing, because now you can't hear the research side, things like that. Because,
Yeah. I'd love to come to these talks every week and hear them. Actually, we can log on.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, guys.